Why you feel so much and say nothing. Have you ever felt a storm raging inside while maintaining a perfect calm on the outside? That moment when your heart pounds against your chest, your thoughts race like wildfire, yet your face reveals nothing, a masterpiece of emotional disguise. You are not alone. This silent suffering is perhaps humanity's most universal yet unspoken epidemic. What would happen if, just for one day, everyone spoke exactly what they felt? The world as we know it would transform instantly. Relationships would crumble or deepen beyond recognition. Workplaces would restructure. Power dynamics would shift dramatically. Perhaps this is why we've collectively agreed to maintain this conspiracy of silence. The stakes feel too high. But what is the cost of this silence? What happens when emotions, designed to be expressed, processed, and released, remain trapped within the prison of your body? Consider this. Every emotion you've ever suppressed still lives somewhere in your nervous system. Every unspoken truth, every swallowed response, every feeling deemed too dangerous to express. They don't simply disappear. They transform, often into physical ailments, psychological distress, or relationships built on foundations of sand. Imagine Sarah, a high-performing executive who received devastating news about her mother's health just before an important presentation. She compartmentalized her grief, delivered the presentation flawlessly, and received accolades from colleagues who had no idea of her inner turmoil. That evening, alone in her apartment, she didn't cry. She ordered takeout, watched mindless television, and responded to emails. 3 months later, she developed chronic migraines and insomnia that no medication seemed to touch. Sarah's story isn't unusual. It's the story of emotional suppression that most of us live every day, to varying degrees. We've been conditioned to believe that emotional containment equals strength, that vulnerability equals weakness, that professional means unemotional. As philosopher Martha Nussbaum argues, we've created upheavals of thought by divorcing our emotions from our rational lives, seeing them as disruptions rather than valuable intelligence. The ancient Stoics advocated for apatheia, freedom from disruptive emotions, but modern interpretations have twisted this into emotional suppression. The Stoics actually encouraged acknowledging emotions while not being controlled by them, a crucial distinction lost in our keep calm and carry on culture. The truth is, your emotions exist for critical evolutionary reasons. Fear warns of danger. Anger signals boundary violations. Sadness processes loss. Joy connects you to what matters. Emotions are sophisticated information systems that have ensured human survival for millennia. When you silence them, you're essentially unplugging from your most ancient guidance system. Psychologist Carl Jung warned, "What you resist persists." Or more specifically, what you resist not only persists, but grows in size. The emotions you refuse to feel don't simply dissolve. They go underground, finding subversive ways to influence your behavior, health, and relationships. Research in psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how psychology affects our nervous and immune systems, shows that emotional suppression is linked to decreased immune function, increased stress hormones, heart disease, digestive disorders, and even certain cancers. Your body keeps the score, as trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk famously noted. But beyond physical health, emotional silence extracts an even greater toll on your sense of authenticity and connection. Philosopher Martin Buber spoke of it versus I-thou relationships. When you hide your true emotional experience, all your relationships become I-it exchanges, transactional, superficial, and ultimately unfulfilling. You may be physically present but emotionally absent, creating what psychologists call intimacy barriers that prevent genuine connection. Think about how many times you've responded, "I'm fine," when you were anything but fine. How many times have you nodded in agreement while screaming internally? How often have you smiled through pain because expressing it seemed too risky? In his seminal work, The Divided Self, psychiatrist R.D. Laing described how we develop a false self to please others and fit in, while our true self remains hidden and unexpressed. Over time, this division creates profound psychological distress. You become a stranger to yourself, playing a role rather than living authentically. Consider James, a middle school teacher who realized he'd spent decades repressing his creative ambitions. As a child, his artistic endeavors were met with his father's practical concerns about financial stability. Slowly, he learned to silence his creative voice, pursuing a sensible career path instead. At 45, despite his outward success, he felt a pervasive emptiness he couldn't name. When he finally began creating art again, hesitantly in private moments, he described it as reuniting with a lost part of myself. The emotions that flowed through his creative process had been waiting decades for expression. This phenomenon is what philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called despair, not the conventional understanding of extreme sadness, but the specific despair of not being your authentic self, of not expressing your truth. This despair, he argued, is the root of much human suffering. So why do we maintain this silence? Why do we choose emotional suppression despite its devastating costs? The answers lie in our earliest experiences. As children, many of us received clear messages about which emotions were acceptable and which weren't. Big boys don't cry. Nice girls don't get angry. Stop being so sensitive. You're overreacting. These messages became internalized rules about emotional expression. Additionally, we've witnessed what happens to those who do express their emotions freely. They're often labeled dramatic, unstable, unprofessional, too much. In a world that prizes rationality and composure above all, emotional expression can seem like a liability. There's also the universal fear of rejection. Emotions make us vulnerable, and vulnerability always carries risk. What if I express my true feelings and you leave? What if my authentic emotional reality is too much for you to handle? What if my emotions make you uncomfortable? These fears are not irrational, they're based on very real experiences of emotional abandonment. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, observed that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. This space, between feeling an emotion and deciding how to express it, is where our growth opportunity lies. The solution isn't to swing to the opposite extreme of unfiltered emotional expression with no boundaries. That approach creates its own problems. Instead, the path forward is one of emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, name, and appropriately express emotions. This journey begins with emotional literacy, learning to identify what you're actually feeling beyond the basic categories of good or bad. Most adults can only identify 3 to 5 distinct emotions in themselves, while researchers have identified at least 27 distinct emotional states. This limited emotional vocabulary means many emotions go unnamed and therefore unaddressed. Can you distinguish between disappointment and desolation? Between annoyance and resentment? Between contentment and joy? Each emotion carries specific information and calls for different responses. Without this nuanced understanding, you're navigating complex emotional terrain with a crude map. The next step is emotional validation, giving yourself permission to feel whatever arises without judgment. This doesn't mean acting on every emotion, but it does mean acknowledging their presence and legitimacy. As psychologist Carl Rogers noted, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. With this foundation, you can begin practicing appropriate emotional expression. This doesn't mean emotional flooding, overwhelming others with unprocessed feelings, but rather clear, owned communication. I feel disappointed when plans change last minute, rather than, you always ruin everything. I'm feeling anxious about this deadline, instead of pushing through stress until you burn out. Philosopher Alain de Botton suggests that we suffer from emotional realism, the mistaken belief that others can realistically perceive our inner emotional states without our explicit communication. This fallacy leads to disappointment and resentment when others fail to respond to emotions we've never actually expressed. Learning to express emotions effectively requires understanding that different contexts call for different levels of disclosure. Emotional intelligence includes discernment about when, where, how, and with whom to share your emotional reality. Not everyone has earned access to your innermost feelings, and not every setting is appropriate for deep emotional expression. This is where having emotional confidants becomes essential. People with whom you can be emotionally authentic without fear of judgment or rejection. These relationships serve as pressure release valves for emotions that might be inappropriate to express in other contexts. Consider Michael, who grew up in a household where emotions were seen as weaknesses. As an adult, he maintained this stoicism, rarely expressing vulnerability even with his wife. When he lost his job after 15 years at the same company, he told no one, maintaining his morning routine of leaving the house in business attire, while actually spending days in coffee shops applying for jobs. The strain of this secret led to panic attacks, which finally forced him to disclose his situation. To his surprise, his wife's response wasn't disappointment but hurt. Not that he'd lost his job, but that he hadn't trusted her with his struggle. "I didn't marry your success," she told him. "I married you." This story illuminates another cost of emotional silence. It robs others of the opportunity to truly know and support you. It assumes that others cannot handle your emotional reality, which is often untrue and unfair. Eastern philosophical traditions offer valuable perspectives on emotional processing. Buddhist mindfulness practices teach neither suppression nor indulgence of emotions, but rather a middle path of awareness and non-attachment. This approach allows emotions to arise and pass naturally, like weather patterns moving through the sky of consciousness. Similarly, ancient Japanese culture embraced the concept of mono no aware, the pathos of things, a gentle sadness at the impermanence of life that was considered not just acceptable, but beautiful. This cultural framework allowed for the expression of melancholy without pathologizing it. Modern psychology has validated these ancient practices. Techniques like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, encourage developing psychological flexibility, the ability to be present with difficult emotions while still moving toward valued goals. This approach recognizes that avoiding emotional discomfort ultimately creates greater suffering than facing it directly. The journey toward emotional expression isn't linear. There will be missteps and overcorrections. You may swing between silence and oversharing before finding balance. This is natural and part of developing any new skill. What matters is beginning. Start small. Practice naming your emotions to yourself before expressing them to others. Notice the physical sensations that accompany different emotional states. Write what you cannot yet speak. Find safe relationships for emotional practice. Remember that emotional expression isn't just about negative emotions. Many people are equally uncomfortable expressing joy, pride, or love. Full emotional literacy means embracing the entire spectrum of human feeling, allowing yourself to be moved by beauty, touched by kindness, and transformed by connection. Philosopher Aristotle proposed that the good life requires emotional wisdom, feeling the right emotion, in the right measure, at the right time, for the right reason. This doesn't happen naturally. It requires conscious development. As you develop this capacity, you'll likely encounter resistance, both internal and external. Inner critics will question the validity of your feelings. Some relationships may struggle to adapt to your new emotional authenticity. Systems built around your silence may push back against your voice. Stand firm. Your emotions are not excessive. Your capacity to express them has been unnaturally constrained. What feels overwhelming at first is simply the release of emotions that have been dammed up for years, perhaps decades. As you develop regular practices of emotional expression, this flood will naturally regulate into a manageable flow. Remember that emotional expression isn't merely self-indulgence. It's an act of courage that benefits the collective. When you express your authentic emotional reality, you create space for others to do the same. You help dismantle the cultural conspiracy of silence that keeps so many trapped in isolation. French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote about the visible and invisible aspects of human experience. How much of what matters most remains unseen and unspoken. Your emotional landscape is perhaps the most significant of these invisible realms. When you find words for it, you make the invisible visible, not just for yourself, but for everyone your life touches. In a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence and digital interaction, your emotional depth and expressiveness become ever more precious. They are what make you irreplaceably human. Your capacity to feel deeply and communicate those feelings authentically is not a liability to be managed, but a gift to be developed. So I ask you, what emotion are you feeling right now that remains unexpressed? What truth lives in your body that has never found its way to your lips? What might change if you finally gave it voice? The cost of continued silence is a life half-lived, relationships built on partial truths, a self fragmented by suppression, a contribution to the world diminished by fear. The reward of expression is integration, authenticity, and the profound relief of finally being known. The choice, to remain silent or to speak your emotional truth, may seem small in any given moment, but these moments accumulate eventually, defining the course of your life. Will you continue to be the keeper of secrets from yourself and others? Or will you accept the invitation to emotional authenticity with all its messiness and magnificence? Your emotions are not too much. It is the silence that has become unbearable. Your voice matters, not despite your feelings, but because of them. The world doesn't need more silent sufferers. It needs the transformative power of emotional truth. The next time you feel that storm inside, consider this. Perhaps what needs to change is not the intensity of your feelings, but your willingness to give them a voice.